My name is Lena Torres. I am 31, and at Sunrise Mart, people like to joke that I am the walking notebook of the entire operations department. They say it for fun, but they are not wrong. My paper title is just Operations Coordinator, which sounds like a simple support role. In reality, I manage almost everything: workflow, schedules, stock reports, the small supply chain, and the mess every other manager leaves behind. I know every inbound procedure, every POS error code, even the little tricks that keep the warehouse from drowning in stacked pallets. I am the person everyone goes to when a spreadsheet starts acting possessed, or when no one remembers how a process even began. I never let mistakes roll downhill to someone else, because the thing I fear most is making another person suffer for something I missed. My weakness is simple: I am terrible at confrontation. I avoid it every chance I get. Whenever something goes wrong, I am the first to take the blame just to keep the peace, even when I did nothing wrong. And if someone else takes credit for my work, I just smile and let it go. I tell myself I do it to avoid trouble, but sometimes I wonder if I have stayed in the background so long that I no longer dare to step forward. I live with my mother. She is nearly 70 and struggles with severe arthritis, and my younger brother, who attends night classes in auto repair to save money on tuition. We rent a small apartment on the west side of Phoenix. It is old and cramped, but the rent is low enough to survive. My mornings always start at 6. I prep lunch for my mom, sort out her medication, then pack a lunch for myself. My go to is marinated roasted chicken using my mother's spices and the salsa I chop by hand. Making my own meals keeps costs down. Important months when medical bills stack up, or on weeks when my old Honda decides to turn the check engine light into a personality trait. I cannot lose this job, not now. That morning, the one everything hinged on, was so blistering hot that even at 6:30, the air felt thick enough to slice. That is Phoenix in summer. When I pulled into the lot, the temperature number on the dashboard made me sigh out loud. A coworker messaged the group chat saying the warehouse AC had died the night before. I could already picture the staff sweating through their shirts while the freight kept coming, because boxes do not wait for anybody. I hugged my meal prep container to my chest and walked along the back path to avoid the sun. That is when I saw him. A middle-aged man in a faded blue work shirt, dust-stained pants, and boots worn thin at the soles. He was sitting on the concrete steps, head down, adjusting the tools in his kit. Beside him sat an empty food container, as he had eaten long ago, but never quite recovered the energy. His face was flushed from the heat, sweat running through the deep lines along his cheek. I assumed he was the HVAC tech called in to fix the warehouse cooling system. He had that familiar look of people who work outside in Arizona and carry the sun on their backs. He glanced up when I walked by, scooting over a little to make space, still polite even though he looked exhausted. I do not know what made me stop. Maybe the empty box. Maybe the recognition in his face. That expression of someone who has worked too long without anyone noticing. I looked down at my packed lunch, the warm chicken, the salsa, and then back at him. I handed it to him before I had time to think. He looked genuinely surprised and asked if I was sure. I nodded. Something tightened in my chest when he thanked me in that rough, tired voice. I told him not to skip meals in this heat and hurried off when I realized I was running late. As I turned into the main hallway, I heard the familiar sound of Mark's footsteps. He looked at his watch, then at me, like he had just caught an employee sneaking around. He grabbed my ID lanyard to check the timestamp and delivered a line I had heard too many times. "You are making the whole team look bad." That is Mark. Always like that. He loves speaking loudly enough for others to hear, loves interrupting me mid-sentence, and loves taking my ideas into meetings without once mentioning my name. He will ask me to write the reports he needs for leadership, then act like he built them from scratch. When something goes wrong, he says I am too perfectionistic or too slow, even when the mistake was not mine. He never yells, but the worst part is the tone that drips, the condescending look, the way he acts like I should be grateful he gave me a chance. After tossing out his complaint, he spun around and barked at me to keep up. He said I was not to embarrass him during this morning's big meeting, that someone from the board was visiting, and he wanted everything flawless. I tightened my grip on my ID badge, walked faster behind him, and hoped giving my lunch to a stranger would not turn out to be the decision I regretted a few hours later. As I followed Mark, a thought flickered across my mind, wondering if anyone had ever stumbled into a morning as ridiculous as mine. And if you are listening to this story right now and you have worked in a place like this, tell me where you are listening from. And if you enjoy quiet, clever revenge stories, stay with me. Trust me, what happened next was more worth the wait than I ever expected. I walked right behind Mark as we headed toward the main conference room. The air in the hallway was stretched tight like a pulled wire. Sunrise Mart had not felt like a functioning company for months. Sales were down, stores were losing customers to tougher competitors, and the Phoenix warehouse staff had even staged a half-day walkout because of short staffing. The turnover rate was so high that HR joked they could not order name tags fast enough for the new hires. It was a joke, but everyone knew the company was in a real crisis. Last week, the board announced it would bring in a new chief executive officer. The news spread across every desk, and no one dared to ask if layoffs were coming next. The room was packed when I stepped inside. Cold lights reflected off the long wooden table, giving the space a formality that made my shoulders tighten. I was looking for a seat when my whole body froze. The man at the head of the table, flipping through a blue folder, was the same man I had handed my lunch to that morning, except he was no longer wearing a faded work shirt. He wore a sharp navy suit, and his eyes were razor clear. In front of him sat a fresh nameplate: Ethan Cole, Chief Executive Officer. I had never met him, but I had heard rumors. Sunrise Mart had hired a chief executive known for being relentless in restructuring. I did not expect that man to be the same one who had sat on a concrete step in 110-degree heat, with a toolkit beside him. Thanking me in a voice worn down by the sun, Ethan looked up just as I sat down. His eyes met mine for a single second, no more, then he turned back to his documents without a single acknowledgement of the morning. No hint that he recognized me, but I knew he had seen me. Mark, of course, noticed nothing. As usual, he marched in like he was about to lead the meeting, even though that role had never been his. He shook the chief executive's hand and immediately launched into his performance. In 30 seconds, he fired off so many buzzwords I could recite them in my sleep. We are aiming for strategic alignment across all departments. We want to enhance the customer journey and build stronger vertical leverage. I sat still, listening like someone forced to hear an old song stuck on repeat. Anyone who worked with Mark knew he loved fancy words, even when the meaning was hollow. Then he introduced me. This is Lena. She is good with paperwork. I handle the big picture leadership. Heat rushed into my chest, not because it was new, but because he had repeated it so many times that part of me had started to believe it. I lowered my head and pretended to write something just to avoid the eyes in the room. Ethan still did not react. He simply set his pen down and asked the first question. Can you describe the warehouse workflow during peak hours? Mark started talking about leadership and delegation, not a single actual step. I saw a few coworkers struggle to keep straight faces. Ethan did not interrupt, just listened until the end before asking the next question. When a supplier delivers late, how does your department respond? Mark spoke again about long-term vision, strategic communication, and a handful of terms that sounded important but meant nothing. Ethan nodded once and then shifted to me. Lena, can you explain briefly what happens when an order is delayed by 3 hours? My heartbeat quickened. I hated being the center of attention, but I could not afford to answer poorly, so I told him the real process: contacting the backup supplier, reprioritizing the incoming orders, updating the system so the warehouse could rearrange its shifts, sending a report to the supervisor. I kept it short, clear, and grounded in what actually happened. Ethan jotted down a note and simply said, "Thank you." No praise. But I noticed a few coworkers glance at Mark with new understanding. The questioning continued in the same pattern. Ethan asked about real operations. Mark answered with polished nonsense. And I supplied the working details. I was not trying to show off, but with each answer, it felt like another crack appeared in the glossy leadership image Mark had built for years. The air shifted. No one said a word, but everyone felt the contrast. Mark looked like a hollow suit. And I, the person who always sat at the far end of the table, was suddenly the one who actually knew how the system ran. Ethan remained quiet most of the time, but now and then his eyes paused on me, not with curiosity, not with special warmth, but with the assessing look of someone measuring the truth of a person who did not yet understand her own value. Finally, when Mark launched into a rambling explanation of a strategy I knew he had invented in the car on the way over, Ethan closed the folder. I think we have enough for today. The words were soft, almost gentle, but sharp enough to slice the entire room into silence. People near the door stood faster than usual. Mark hesitated, confused, unable to understand why the meeting ended so abruptly. He searched the chief executive's face for a clue, but Ethan offered none. I gathered my notebook and walked out last. As my hand touched the door, I paused for a moment. Ethan was looking at the documents, but his head turned slightly toward me, like he knew I had stopped. I did not know if he remembered my face from that morning, but one thing was clear. From the moment he asked the first question, Sunrise Mart had entered a new chapter, and so had I. The meeting ended, but its weight followed me through the rest of the morning. I could feel something had shifted, not inside the conference room, but in the way people started watching each other the moment we stepped into the hallway. Little conversations died as I walked past. A few glances were exchanged, the kind you cannot quite decode. The only thing I understood was this: Ethan's arrival had shaken loose a layer of dust that had settled on this place for far too long. Ethan's first official day as Chief Executive Officer did not happen in his polished office. It unfolded almost entirely in the warehouse behind the building. I found out when a supervisor messaged our internal group chat. The chief executive just walked past aisle number 3 and asked every worker how many overtime hours they had this month. And it was not the polite kind of question. He wrote down every answer. He also asked about leadership, about a culture of accountability, about whether the warehouse staff ever felt heard. A longtime employee, Sam, answered, without hesitation, "We do not have a leadership problem. We have a Mark problem." My heart dropped when I read it. Not because I disagreed, but because a comment like that, if it reached Mark, would only make things worse. And when Mark looked for someone to blame, I was almost always the first name he reached for. While the warehouse whispered about the new chief executive, Mark stayed busy planning how to get close to him. Right before lunch, I saw Mark standing in front of the mirror in the small meeting room, adjusting his tie and rehearsing a short introduction. One line he repeated so many times, I memorized it. "I am basically the brain of operations around here." When Ethan walked through the office area, Mark immediately followed him, cheerful like they had been friends for years. I overheard Mark inviting the chief executive to lunch at an expensive steakhouse downtown. Ethan declined politely, saying he wanted to spend his first day understanding employees and real issues before discussing vision. Mark tried to smile, but it was clear he was not used to being turned down. By the afternoon, the chief executive's emails started flooding every department. He requested detailed reports on overtime for the past 6 months, equipment breakdowns, late deliveries, and the list of stores with operating costs over budget. And of course, the person responsible for pulling all that data together was me. I opened every report, every spreadsheet, every chart. The numbers were brutal. There were periods when overtime spiked nearly 40% because of staffing shortages. 3 weeks straight when transportation delays piled up. More than 7 incidents where the warehouse had to use backup plans because of poor coordination. I knew the board would have questions, and Mark had never handled questions well. As I was reviewing the numbers one last time, Mark appeared behind me. He did not knock, he did not ask if I was busy. He simply placed a hand on my desk and spoke in that fake, friendly tone I knew too well. "Let us make the numbers reflect our effort, okay?" I looked up at him, keeping my face steady. "What do you want me to do?" Mark leaned closer, lowering his voice like he was doing me a favor. "You worry too much. This is how corporate works. We show progress, no problems." He wanted me to lower the overtime numbers so they looked reasonable, adjust the maintenance timeline so the warehouse does not seem mismanaged, combine multiple late deliveries into one so it would not look like the system was failing. With every word he said, a cold line ran down my spine. I knew exactly what manipulating data could cost. It was not just wrong, it could destroy my entire career. But if I refused, Mark had 1,000 ways to make my job miserable. He could tank my performance review. Claim I was not a cultural fit. Transfer me to a far-off branch. I even convinced HR that I was no longer aligned with company values. I was the only stable income in my household. My mother needed medication every month. My brother needed help with tuition. I did not have the luxury of walking away. I sat frozen, hands still on the keyboard, mind spinning between two equally terrifying paths. I had not even answered when Mark patted my shoulder lightly, as if the decision had already been made. Good. I know you will handle it. He walked away before I could say a word. I stayed late after everyone left, staring at the report open on my screen. The raw numbers, honest and unfiltered, exposed everything that had been rotting for months. But I knew if I sent them as they were, Mark would be back at my desk demanding changes. A few minutes later, my phone buzzed. A new email. I opened it and my breath caught. From Ethan Cole, subject clarification. The message contained only one sentence. Could you help clarify a few discrepancies? Your insight seems valuable. I stared at the screen. It was not from Mark. It was not a request to modify numbers. It was not manipulation. It was a direct question, straightforward, professional, the way real American leaders communicate. But to me, it felt like a door had cracked open in a place I thought was sealed shut. I leaned back in my chair and exhaled slowly. I still did not know how I would reply, but for the first time in years, I felt like someone actually saw the work I did, the effort I had poured in just to keep the system from collapsing on itself. I turned off my desk lamp, gathered my things, and stepped out of the office. I knew the game had changed, and from now on, every decision I made would not just affect Mark, it might shape my entire future at Sunrise Mart. The next morning, just as I set my coffee cup on my desk, the company-wide inbox lit up nonstop. A new email from HR, the kind with a long, heavy corporate title that tells you instantly the news will not be pleasant. Internal compliance and operational audit kickoff. I opened it and read the familiar polished lines that anyone in American corporate life can translate without effort. To ensure transparency and performance integrity. To align departmental outcomes with corporate goals. To identify gaps and process inefficiencies. Words dressed up to sound routine, but everyone in this industry knows what they really mean. Anyone could end up under review. Even though the email insisted the audit was about systems, not individuals, the office tightened around me, like someone had pulled an invisible wire across every desk. People typed faster, spoke less, and swallowed half-finished sentences. I noticed a couple of hands trembling slightly over keyboards. Still, everyone pretended to be calm, as if we were all employees with absolutely nothing to hide. About an hour later, Mark called everyone into the small meeting room at the end of the hall. Once we sat, he stood at the whiteboard, marker in hand, like he was about to present a major initiative. He started with his usual line, "We need unity right now. That is the key." He said audits were normal, that every large company conducted them regularly, and that we should not let the atmosphere rattle us. But his voice did not match the content. It felt more like a warning than a reassurance, and I became certain of it when he looked around the room and kept his gaze on me the longest. This is not the time to overcomplicate things or talk too much about internal issues. Keep everything clean and simple. We present a united front. No one asked questions. No one wanted to be the person to irritate Mark. I stayed quiet too, but my stomach sank. I knew this type of meeting. On the surface, it was encouragement. Underneath, it was a reminder not to tell the audit anything he did not approve. Early in the afternoon, Mark called me into his office. He closed the door, the old air conditioner humming weakly. He leaned against his desk, arms crossed, like he was sizing me up. "Lena, you know you owe me a lot." I looked up. "Owe you." He stepped closer. "I have protected you more times than you know. You think people appreciate your perfectionism. They do not. I covered for you, and now we are in this together. If this goes wrong, we both go down." A bitter laugh almost rose in my throat, but I kept it inside. I had never needed him to cover for me, but Mark's version of reality had never been connected to the truth. He placed a stack of papers in front of me and tapped the edge. "We need to clean up some descriptions in the process documentation before the audit reviews them. Not a big deal. Just align the wording. No need to make it dramatic." I flipped through a few pages. Every section he wanted changed was tied to something I had reported, notes I had written flagging risks, emails I had sent with subject lines like potential issue, recommendations I had begged him to consider. He wanted me to erase every trace of him, ignoring my warnings. I looked at him, said nothing. Mark exhaled sharply, annoyed. Stop overthinking. This is how leadership works. Small adjustments for the bigger picture. He thought that line would make me obedient. Instead, it showed me the fear leaking through the cracks in his fake confidence. He needed me to be complicit, needed me to rewrite the documentation so he could tell the audit that the system had been tightly managed all along. After Mark left the room, I held the packet in my hands, heavy as stone. Back at my desk, I turned on my computer, and instead of opening the files he wanted edited, I opened a different folder, my private one, buried 4 layers deep. Inside it was every email I had ever sent, warning that the warehouse was overloaded, the ones Mark had brushed aside. The strange invoices I had questioned with no response. The Excel sheets I saved whenever numbers were altered without explanation. Every timestamp, every side note, every detail I kept out of habit to protect myself in a system where blame could fall without warning. I stared at the files, hundreds of small but unmistakable pieces of evidence. My chest tightened. I did not want to be someone who harmed others, but I also could not keep letting someone like Mark manipulate me and push me toward danger. Late afternoon, I drove home. In our small apartment, my mother tried to stand from the sofa, her knees cracking in a way she hoped I would not hear. I rushed to help her and eased her back down. When I set dinner in front of her, she gave me a soft, tired smile. And in that moment, the reason I needed this job came back to me as sharply as the day I started. I could not afford a mistake. My brother stepped out of his room, looked at me, and frowned. You okay? You look worn out. I nodded, but said nothing. I could not drag him into this. I did not want him worrying. The silence settled between us, a heavy pause that made me realize this was not just a work problem, it was a crossroads. That night, after everyone was asleep, I sat at the table, turned on my laptop, and opened my private folder again. I did not know what waited ahead, but I knew one thing: I could not delete anything. I could not pretend the truth was not there. I plugged a USB drive into the laptop, the small sound echoing like a wager being placed. I backed up every file, every image, every line. When the progress bar reached 100%, I removed the USB, placed it in the bottom drawer, and closed it. I did not know if this would save me or pull me into something even more dangerous. But I knew one thing with absolute certainty. For the first time in years, I had chosen not to stay silent. 3 days after the audit email went out, the office felt like a storm cloud was forming right above our ceiling. No one said a word, but I could feel the worry sliding through every step, every keystroke slowing just a little. I was reviewing the overtime sheet when a message from finance popped up in the corner of my screen. Subject: Exception Report, Quarter 2 and Quarter 3. I opened the file and my chest dropped. This was not a normal spreadsheet. It was the kind of report that listed unusual expenses, suspected irregularities, or items that did not match approved procedures. Every line was a spotlight aimed directly at misconduct, and most of those lines pointed straight at Mark. There was an invoice for a luxury lunch at a steakhouse on the same day. Mark told me he had an important vendor meeting, but the spreadsheet note said no vendor confirmed any appointment. There was a travel expense to Denver tagged as market research, even though I knew Mark never left Phoenix that week. He posted gym stories every day. A vendor labeled as a personal acquaintance was paid 3 times in the same month, even though the approval process required 2 levels of sign-off and a written explanation. There was no explanation attached. And another odd charge appeared: a consulting fee for something called an efficiency review, billed under the LLC owned by Mark's cousin. Each line in that spreadsheet told its own story, and none of the stories defended Mark. Less than 2 hours later, Mark called the whole department into the conference room. He was not calm this time. His face was flushed like a sunburn, and his voice was sharp and too loud. Everyone calm down. These numbers are taken out of context. The audit team does not understand our workflow. A junior analyst hesitantly asked what the audit team needed. Mark snapped, They want clarity, which I will provide, but only if everyone here stops making this bigger than it is. When someone mentioned the spreadsheet exceptions, Mark slammed his pen down. If finance had done its job correctly, we would not be having this conversation. The air turned heavy enough to crush a rib. A couple of younger staff members exchanged glances while trying not to laugh when Mark started misusing financial terms. He said cash flow when he meant operating costs, revenue when discussing rebate programs, and my personal favorite, he declared with complete confidence that amortization meant reducing working hours to save money. Two people lowered their heads, shoulders shaking as they tried not to burst out laughing. If the situation were not so tense, I might have laughed too, but something worse was coming. When the meeting ended, Mark called me in. The door closed, the click of the lock sounding like a warning. He placed a fresh stack of documents in front of me, all rewritten from specific to vague. Numbers softened, problems blurred. And the worst part was the final page, a declaration. I confirmed that the outlined process was followed during quarter 2 and quarter 3. A short sentence, but in American corporate culture, it carried real legal risk. Signing it meant confirming every operational step was correct, including the parts Mark ignored, altered, or replaced with his own shortcuts. One signature could tie me to him if investigators dug any deeper. Mark pushed the document toward me. You are the process expert. This will not hold up unless you sign it. I swallowed hard. But a few items here were updated without any clear justification. He leaned over the table, voice sharpening. Do you want this department to survive the audit or not? Lena, focus. This is not the time to get stuck on small details. Small. Some of those details were serious enough to qualify as falsified reporting. He did not ease up. If this goes bad, it will not be just me. They will come for whoever handled the documentation. You. The words cut clean, not a threat, just the reality of corporate America. Paper trails always lead somewhere, and the person managing the records is the easiest one to blame. I looked at the paper, then at Mark. He thought I was hesitating, thinking. I kept my face still. I need a moment to review it first. His smile was tight as wire. Fine. Do not take too long. He walked out, leaving me with a stack of documents and a ticking bomb. The moment the door shut, I grabbed my phone. My hands shook a little, but I photographed every page. One picture each, clear, full, no missing corners. I dropped them into my private folder. Then I opened my laptop camera and recorded the entire stack under the meeting room lights, proof that they existed before any edits could be made. When Mark returned, I handed him the papers and said I needed more time, because a few details did not match the original data. He looked irritated, but he could not force the issue yet. End of day, Lena. No later. I nodded and walked out. I had barely reached my desk when a new email pinged. Not from Mark, not from Audit, from Ethan Cole. Subject: Private review request. The message was brief but razor clear. Could you provide clarification on the discrepancies found in the exceptions report? I would appreciate your direct insight before proceeding further. I read it again and again. It was not coercive, not manipulative, not soft pressure disguised as leadership. It was a straightforward professional request. But it was also the most dangerous invitation I had ever received. No one invites you to a private review when everything is fine. I opened my hidden folder, plugged in my USB drive, transferred every photo, added the evidence I had collected over the past months. My hands were cold, but my mind was sharp. The afternoon dragged on. When the office lights dimmed, another email appeared. Meeting scheduled. Participants: Ethan Cole, HR Director, Legal Counsel, Lena Torres. Time is 9 in the morning tomorrow. I stared at the line for a long moment. A closed-door meeting with HR and legal is never small. It is the moment when truth and risk stand side by side. And I, someone who only ever wanted to do my job right, was suddenly at the center of the storm. I shut down my computer, tightened my grip on the USB drive, and understood one thing clearly. Tomorrow would decide everything. Mark, the audit, and my future at Sunrise Mart. The next morning, the office was covered in a silence so thick I could hear the faint vibration of the air conditioner. I walked into the closed meeting room right on time. The HR director sat at the head of the table. The legal counsel had a stack of documents laid out in front of him, and Ethan sat in the center, hands loosely clasped, focused but not cold. What surprised me most was that nothing about the moment felt accusatory. Instead, the room felt arranged for one purpose: to uncover the truth. Ethan opened the discussion by asking a single pointed question. Lena, I want to hear the real process you have tracked for the past 6 months, not the summarized version. I want the full picture. I took a deep breath and explained everything. I started with the understaffed warehouse, how overtime skyrocketed, the supplier warnings I sent to Mark, the emails left unanswered, and the notes I kept because I knew one day someone would ask for explanations. I did not speak emotionally, only in facts. HR wrote down every detail. Legal nodded whenever I mentioned timestamps. Ethan flipped through my printed documents, asking a question now and then to make sure he understood the specifics. You said Mark edited the process description before sending it to audit. I nodded. And this is the original. When did you back it up? Right before it was altered. I photographed the physical copy and saved it in my folder. He exchanged a brief look with legal. No one said it, but we all understood how serious that was in American corporate culture. After nearly 40 minutes, Ethan leaned back slightly, fingers interlaced. Thank you. Everything you presented is clear and supported by documentation. HR gave me a glance that was hard to read. We will invite Mark in to hear his side. You may stay. The door opened. Mark walked in, his face no longer the panicked mask from yesterday. To my surprise, he did not start with an attack. Instead, he sat down, exhaled like a man trying to hold himself together, and said, "Thank you for giving me a chance to explain." Ethan did not exchange pleasantries. He simply nodded. We want to hear your interpretation of the numbers and the materials Lena provided. Mark looked at me for a second, then lowered his eyes to the papers. I know there are a lot of questions, and I understand why the audit team is concerned, but I want everyone here to know that I have been under immense pressure from the board for the last 8 months. Revenue dropped, staffing collapsed, budgets were cut. I was trying to keep things afloat under very difficult circumstances. I was surprised. This was not the Mark I knew. He was choosing the soft strategy, and to be fair, part of what he said was true. Mark continued. I made mistakes by not addressing the warehouse issues properly. I admit that, but I did not intend to hide anything. Some financial decisions may look questionable, but they were part of maintaining operations. HR tilted her head slightly. For example, this steakhouse charges. Mark let out a frustrated breath. I tried to meet a vendor there. They canceled last minute. It was my mistake to include the receipt in the expense report, but it was not intentional deception. I meant to correct it, but got pulled into other crises. I studied him. Mark was doing something I had never witnessed. He was not blaming someone else, not shouting, not pretending to be the victim. He was showing just enough honesty to stay believable. Then he turned toward Ethan. I know I have shortcomings, but I want to remind everyone that I led the cost optimization project last year. I helped the Glendale store cut inventory expenses by 18%, and the automated reporting system I built is still functioning. I am not denying my errors, but I do not want to be seen as entirely incompetent. Silently, I acknowledged something. Mark had once been capable. He was not empty, but over time, power and pride had warped him. Ethan nodded, slightly, not denying it. I reviewed your performance history. You contributed in the past. That is not in question. Mark's head lifted, a flicker of hope in his eyes. Ethan placed both hands on the table. But what we are evaluating now is not your competence. It is the boundary between leadership and abuse of authority. The room froze. Ethan looked directly at Mark. Leadership is not asking staff to alter numbers to protect your image. Leadership is not ignoring critical warnings. Leadership is not using company funds in questionable ways and hoping no one notices. Mark swallowed hard, the color draining from his face. Ethan continued, voice steady and sharp. You once had the ability, but ability without responsibility becomes a liability to the entire system. Mark opened his mouth as if to defend himself, but HR raised a hand gently. We are not concluding anything today. There will be further evaluation. You may step out for now. Mark stood. For a few seconds, he could not produce a single word. He glanced at me, confusion and something unnameable in his eyes. Not anger, not gratitude, more like someone trying to understand how far I had gone. Then he walked out. The door closed. Ethan looked at me. "Thank you for staying." I nodded, though my pulse was still racing. I did not know whether this meeting would protect me or expose me. I only knew I had told the truth. Ethan gathered the documents. "The next steps will be communicated. We will review all evidence thoroughly before making a final decision." No one said Mark would be fired. No one said he would stay. Everything hung in a tense balance, like a wire waiting to snap. I left the room with a tightness in my chest. I had survived one wave, but I had no idea whether the shore ahead was calm or hiding another storm. Only one thing was certain. Whatever came next was now beyond Mark's control, and beyond mine. In the days after the closed-door meeting, the office felt like a strange new organism. No one said anything directly, but everything, from the way people looked at each other to the way they moved, had shifted. I had never seen Sunrise Mart this quiet. It felt like a storm had just passed, and everyone was checking to see whether they were still in one piece. The first thing I noticed was that HR had suddenly become overly polite. Instead of their usual clipped tone, they greeted me as softly as a breeze. One HR rep even tapped gently on my desk before handing me a minor update, adding, "If you need emotional support or time off, please let me know." I almost did not know how to respond. Then legal emailed me to check in, asking whether I needed help with documentation, whether I wanted them to store backup copies, whether I needed any guidance on the audit protocol. It was the kind of email you see in movies, not real life. Legal had never, in my entire time here, reached out to me first. And what surprised me most was the tone. Professional, but respectful in a way that felt foreign. Coworkers changed too. A staff member from purchasing walked over, placed a latte on my desk, and gave me a shy smile. "I never got to thank you. We know you deal with more than we realized." A cashier from the Glendale store came by to drop off paperwork and slipped a homemade muffin into my hand on the way out. "I just wanted to say thank you. You always replied to our emails the fastest." Those small things made my throat tighten. After years of being invisible, it felt like someone had finally turned on the lights. But not every change was pleasant. One morning, while I was pouring coffee in the pantry, a senior manager, someone who barely remembered my name for years, walked in and smiled so warmly I almost spilled the cup. "Lily, how are you holding up?" I blinked. "I am Lena." He froze for a second, then laughed louder. "Right, right. Lena, you are doing great work. We really appreciate you." I did not know how to answer. It was almost funny, but it made something else painfully clear. People now realized I was standing close to a dividing line, even if I had not fully accepted it myself. That afternoon, an email from Ethan landed in my inbox. Subject: Critical Responsibilities Memo. The message held only 2 lines. "Lena, I need you to prepare a summary of the core functions of the operations department. Include items that would disrupt activity if missing. You understand these best." This was not a normal email. In American corporate culture, when a chief executive asks someone for a critical responsibilities memo, it means one of two things. That person is about to be promoted, or they are stepping into a coordinating role during a transition. Both options were significant, and both made my heartbeat quicken. I steadied myself, opened a new document, and began typing the bullet points I knew by heart. Procurement timeline, warehouse routing, vendor fallback, sequence, policy exceptions. I understood each part so deeply that it felt like I had built the system myself. I was focused when my phone buzzed. A message from Mark. He wanted to meet me in the parking lot. I stood up, inhaled slowly, and walked downstairs. The late afternoon sun reflected off the cars, making the parking lot feel like a quiet stage waiting for the next scene. Mark stood leaning against his SUV, arms crossed. His face looked strange, not angry, not arrogant, something between exhaustion and desperation. When I got close, he spoke immediately. "Lena, I used to trust you. I stopped short. Trust me." He nodded. "You were the only one I could rely on all these years. I know I am rough. I know I push work onto you. But I did it because I trusted you could handle it. If you had clarified a few things more gently in that meeting, maybe I would not be the target right now. I looked at him. This was not the Mark who barked orders or played the victim. This was someone scrambling for a reason to believe he was not about to lose everything. He stepped closer, voice low. If you help me reshape the context, present things in a more positive light, I promise you something: a promotion, a raise. I will put you in the position you deserve. A chill slid down my spine. You are trying to pull me into deeper trouble. Mark shook his head, eyes pleading to a dangerous degree. No, I am giving you a chance. If I fall, you will not survive either. They will ask why you did not report sooner. Why do you have data and never escalate? Do you think you are safe? I heard something I had never heard in his voice before. Real fear. I stood straight, meeting his eyes without backing down. You say you trusted me, but for 6 years, you never saw me. You did not see the hours I stayed late fixing system bugs. You did not see the warnings I sent. You did not see the warehouse drowning. You only saw me when you needed someone to carry the weight for you. I paused, then finally said the words I had been holding in my chest for too long. But I saw everything you did, every single thing. Mark froze, his expression collapsing as if someone had slapped him. I watched the moment he realized I was no longer the silent shadow behind him. I turned away and walked back toward the building. My heart pounded, but my resolve did not waver. That night, I opened the memo again. I deleted the old title, and I typed a new one, my hands steady for the first time in years. Transition and Restructure, Final LT. I looked at my initials at the end of the line. For the first time in years, they carried weight. Not the signature of someone standing in the background, but the mark of someone stepping into the next chapter, even if that chapter was full of storms. That morning, the Sunrise Mart office carried a silence unlike anything I had ever felt. People were working, typing, walking through the halls, but everyone was waiting for the same thing. The audit had stretched past 2 weeks, and anyone who had survived corporate long enough knew one truth: quiet mornings were never a good sign. Right before 9, the front lobby doors opened. 3 men in dark shirts walked in, badges reading Internal Security, the department that only appeared when the company needed to handle something serious without drawing attention. No one said it, but everyone understood. The moment had arrived. I sat at my desk, hands on the keyboard, but unable to focus. Around me, every pair of eyes drifted toward the same place: Mark's office. His door opened. Mark stepped out, a coffee cup in hand. For a brief second, his face showed no emotion. But when the 3 security staff approached, something shifted in his eyes. Not anger, not panic, just the slow recognition of something inevitable. He set the cup down, straightened his jacket, and gave a small nod. A simple gesture, but full of meaning. He knew what was coming. They escorted him into the large conference room. Minutes later, my screen pinged. Required. Please join. When I walked in, Ethan sat at the head of the table. HR and legal flanked him. Mark sat opposite, fingers laced together. The air felt heavy as poured concrete. Ethan opened the meeting. Mark, today we are reviewing the results of the internal investigation. You may present your position before we make a final decision. Mark inhaled slowly, then began speaking, surprisingly calm. I know I am in a difficult position, and I understand why there are so many questions. But before any conclusions are made, I want everyone here to know this. I have been under immense pressure for a long time. Declining revenue, high turnover, dozens of issues are piling up at once. No one can manage flawlessly under circumstances like that. He paused, then continued. I do not deny the mistakes, but I never intended to harm the company. I was trying to keep things running, trying to prevent everything from collapsing. For the first time, I saw Mark speak without deflecting. His voice carried a small trace of sincerity, and in that moment, I understood he had not always been incompetent. He had once worked hard, but power, fear, and the dread of being replaced had twisted him. He lifted his gaze to Ethan. I led the Glendale cost optimization project. I lowered inventory by nearly 20%. I am not someone who only talks. The room stayed silent for a long moment. Then legal opened the file. We acknowledge your contributions, but the investigation revealed actions that cannot be dismissed. He placed the evidence on the table. The process description files show edits and deletions right after the audit announcement. The steakhouse invoice is unrelated to any business meeting. The travel expenses with no supporting documentation. The warning emails from Lena that went unanswered. And finally, two versions of the same process file, the original and the altered one. Side by side, the differences were undeniable. Mark stared at them for several long seconds. No excuses, no denial, just exhaustion settling across his features. Ethan folded his hands. Mark, leadership is not making the numbers look better by altering data. Leadership is not pressuring staff to hide their mistakes. Leadership is not ignoring critical warnings. He paused, voice steady, low, and sharp enough to cut. Leadership is a responsibility, and you stopped taking responsibility a long time ago. The sentence fell like a closing door. Mark lowered his head. I understand. No shouting, no accusations, no attempts to shift blame, just a man facing the consequence of his own choices. HR stood and placed a white envelope on the table. Mark, your employment with Sunrise Mart ends today. Security will escort you out. The standard corporate dismissal. Swift, clean, emotionless. Mark stood. When he turned toward me, his eyes no longer held the sharpness they once had. Only the emptiness of someone who had stood tall and now had to step down. Neither of us said a word. There were too many unsaid things between us to fit into a single sentence. He followed security out. Footsteps echoed down the hall, fading behind the glass doors, a quiet ending, almost frightening in its stillness. A swirl of emotions rose inside me, a flicker of vindication, and a quiet sadness for someone who once had talent but lost himself. When I returned to the conference room, Ethan was still there. He gathered the documents, then motioned for me to follow. We stepped into a small meeting room nearby. I reached for my notebook, but he closed the door and turned to face me, his expression no longer carrying the tension of the previous discussion. He spoke one short sentence, a sentence I will never forget. Let us begin. A week after Mark walked out of the building, Sunrise Mart felt like an entirely different place. Not a dramatic overnight transformation, but as someone had finally opened a window after years of stale air. Fresh wind drifted in quietly but unmistakably. The warehouse no longer echoed with constant complaints, because starting this week, overtime followed clear rules. Whoever signed up first got the slot. Anyone who needed time off for family could switch shifts without being punished. No one was coerced into working anymore. HR launched a new reporting line, a private channel where employees could finally speak honestly about things they once kept silent about. Everyone jokingly called it the finally line. Silly, a little sad, but painfully accurate. It was what people truly felt. Finally, someone was listening. The mid-level managers, the ones who used to avoid meetings out of fear that Mark would interrogate them, suddenly stepped forward with suggestions. I realized not everyone had been incompetent or passive. Many had just been living under Mark's shadow. Once that shadow lifted, their voices finally grew stronger. As for me, my life changed in a single afternoon. Ethan called me into a small conference room. When I walked in, he stood by the whiteboard, marker in hand, as if pausing in the middle of a long-term strategy plan. On the table was a clean, neatly clipped packet. He spoke plainly. Lena, we would like you to take on the role of Director of Operations Support. It took me several seconds to understand I was not dreaming. After 6 years of grinding work, 6 years of carrying more than my job title ever admitted, someone finally saw what I brought to this place. When I brought the appointment letter home, my mother sat on the sofa with her glasses tilted slightly on her nose. She unfolded the paper, read each line, then looked up at me with an expression I will never forget. She said, I am proud of you, Lena. Her voice wavered, maybe out of relief, maybe because she had spent years worrying but never said it out loud. My younger brother leaned over her shoulder, skimmed the page, and pulled me into a tight hug. You finally got seen. A simple sentence, but it landed right in the center of me. 6 years of quiet endurance, 6 years of working without recognition, 6 years walking the line between burnout and survival because I could not afford to risk anything bigger. Now all of it clicked into place. A few days later, I had my first major meeting with Ethan since the promotion. I walked in carrying a lunchbox I had prepared that morning. Nothing fancy, just the same spicy roasted chicken and vegetables I had given him on that brutal 110-degree morning. Ethan looked at the box and let out a soft laugh. "So you are trying to start a tradition," I answered. I thought starting the week with real food could not hurt. He opened the box, the smell warming the room, and said in that steady, honest voice of his, "Lena, that day you did not just give me lunch. You showed me what this place could be. A good company does not start with a strategy, it starts with its people. And you showed me who is actually keeping Sunrise Mart standing." I did not know what to say, so I just nodded. But inside, something was shifting into place, a landmark feeling. Being recognized not because I helped expose someone toxic, but because I truly deserved to be here. From that day on, I worked as a new version of myself, still meticulous, still quiet, still the person who kept the system running smoothly, but no longer invisible. I made suggestions. I pushed back when something was unreasonable. I said no without apologizing. And strangely, no one got upset. It turned out the world adjusts when you decide to stand upright. Nothing was perfect. But for the first time, I felt like I belonged here in a way I never had. As summer began, I noticed a small change that made me smile every morning. I still woke up early to prepare two lunches, one for my mother to take to physical therapy, the other I tucked into my bag. My brother asked, "Who is the second one for?" I joked, "Fate, just in case it shows up somewhere and needs a meal." The truth is, I was not preparing lunch to change anyone's life. I did not expect another miracle like that morning. But I understood something now. Small kindnesses, even tiny ones, sometimes open doors you never knew existed. And so, I end my story here, on a quiet afternoon, sunlight spilling across the window of my new office, the one with the nameplate I waited 6 years to earn. I am still Lena. I still pack my lunch every morning, and I still believe that sometimes a single small act can change an entire life, including your own.